The wind had been howling against the carriage windows since dusk, turning the dark fields of northern England into a moving blur of white and shadow. Eleanor Ward pressed her gloved hand to the cold glass and watched the snow whip sideways over the empty platforms as the train slowed for the last stop before the moors. The announcement over the intercom crackled with interference, but the message was clear enough. This was the end of the line for the night. Beyond this station, the tracks disappeared into storm warnings. Eleanor glanced at the email on her phone one more time, as if the words might suddenly vanish and reveal a cruel joke. "You are invited to Winterhaven Hall as a guest of His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne." The formal phrasing still felt unreal. She was not a person who received invitations from dukes. She was a first-generation university graduate from a terraced house in Leeds, a freelance journalist whose last assignment had been an unpaid article about rising heating bills. Yet the offer had arrived in her inbox 2 weeks earlier, complete with an electronic train ticket and instructions. A car would be waiting at the station to bring her to the estate for a winter retreat. On the platform, the cold bit through her coat the moment she stepped down from the train. Snowflakes stung her cheeks and clung to her eyelashes as she tried to orient herself. The station was small and mostly deserted, and a stone building with a flickering yellow light over the entrance and a bench already half buried beneath snow. For a moment, a wave of doubt washed over her. What if this was a mistake? What if the invitation had been meant for another Eleanor Ward, someone who actually belonged in a place called Winterhaven Hall? Then she saw the man standing under the station light, holding a small sign with her name. He wore a dark overcoat and a wool scarf, his hair damp with snow, his posture precise without seeming stiff. When he caught sight of her, he lowered the sign at once and inclined his head in a slight bow that felt oddly out of time. "Miss Ward?" he called out over the wind. "Yes," she answered, lifting her suitcase and moving toward him, boots slipping slightly on the thin layer of ice. "Welcome," he said. "I'm Daniel, His Grace's driver. The roads are worsening by the hour, so we should leave at once if you're ready." She nodded, too aware of how her cheap suitcase and worn boots must look beside his polished car. The vehicle itself waited at the edge of the small car park, a black, understated SUV rather than the sleek limousine she had half expected. It was practical, she thought, for this weather, practical and serious. As they drove away from the station, the last traces of town disappeared quickly behind them. The road narrowed to a single lane, flanked by dry stone walls, their tops lost beneath growing drifts of snow. The headlights cut through the storm in a tight tunnel of light, revealing brief glimpses of the landscape. Skeletal trees bending under the weight of snow. Distant hills swallowed by low clouds, occasional farmhouses with a single warm window glowing in the night. "Does it often get this bad?" Eleanor asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "Winters can be harsh on the moors, miss. This one came early. His Grace decided to bring everyone in a day sooner, just in case." "Everyone?" she asked. "How many guests are there?" "A small group," he replied after a pause. "Old friends of the family, colleagues, a few new faces. You'll see. Winterhaven is quieter than London, but never truly empty in the season." The way he said "the season" made it sound like something official and ancient, as though winter itself belonged to the dukedom. Eleanor shifted in her seat and pulled her coat tighter. She had researched the Duke of Ashbourne before accepting the invitation, but most of what she had found had been superficial. Photographs of a tall man in a dark suit at charity galas, headlines about land conservation projects, the occasional gossip column speculating about why he remained unmarried in his late 30s. There were mentions of tragedy, too. An accident years ago on the estate, a family member lost, details vague and conflicting. The car climbed steadily, following the curve of the hillside. The snow thickened, tapping against the windscreen in dense, furious bursts. Once, they passed a snowplow moving in the opposite direction, its orange lights blinking through the whiteout. After that, the road seemed to belong to them alone. The sense of isolation grew with every kilometre, settling in her chest like a weight. Just when she began to think they had been swallowed entirely by the storm, the road widened and iron gates appeared ahead, their sharp black bars rising from the snow like the ribs of some enormous creature. 2 stone pillars flanked the entrance, each crowned with a weathered lion. The gates were already open, as if expecting them. Daniel drove through without slowing, and the car's tires crunched over freshly fallen snow on the long, straight drive. Winterhaven Hall emerged from the whiteness a moment later, a vast silhouette of stone and light. The building seemed to grow out of the hillside, its wings extending to either side like open arms. Warm yellow light glowed from many of its tall windows, blurring slightly behind the veil of snow. Smoke rose from several chimneys into the thick night, proof of fires burning somewhere deep inside. Eleanor felt a strange mixture of awe and unease. She had seen grand houses before, but this one felt different. Not a museum or a heritage site, but a place that still lived, still held secrets. The kind of house where decisions were made that might never appear in public records, but whose effects could ripple far beyond these frozen fields. As the car stopped beneath the stone portico, the front doors opened, spilling more light onto the snow-covered steps. A figure stood in the doorway, taller than Daniel, shoulders squared, dark hair slightly longer than fashion demanded. Even from a distance, Eleanor recognized him from the photographs she had seen online. The Duke of Ashbourne had come to the door himself. Her instinct was to smooth her hair, check her coat, make herself smaller or taller or something in between, but there was no time. The door on her side opened, and the cold slapped her cheeks again as she stepped out. The snow was shallower here, swept aside regularly, but the air felt even sharper. She lifted her suitcase from the boot, just as the Duke descended the steps with unhurried strides. "Ms. Ward," he said, his voice low and clear, touched with a northern accent that softened the crispness of his words. "You made it. I was concerned the trains might be cancelled." Up close, he looked less like a photograph and more like a man who had not slept enough. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes and tension in his jaw that did not quite match the formal courtesy of his tone. "Thank you for inviting me, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, hoping her voice did not tremble. "I almost didn't believe the email was real." A corner of his mouth lifted, though the expression did not reach his eyes. "Most real things are doubted at first," he said. "Please come inside. The snow is not in a forgiving mood tonight." As she followed him into the hall, the warmth hit her at once. The entrance was vast, with a high ceiling crossed by dark beams, a wide staircase curving up to a shadowed landing, and polished floors that reflected the light of a chandelier. Coats and scarves hung neatly on a row of hooks, and somewhere deeper in the house she heard the low hum of conversation, the faint clink of glasses, the murmur of a piano. For a moment, Eleanor forgot the storm and the isolation and the strange improbability of being there. She felt only the sense that something important had begun, that whatever had brought her to Winterhaven Hall was larger than a simple invitation and would not let her leave unchanged. Outside, unseen from the warmth of the grand entrance, snow continued to fall over the hills and valleys of the estate. On a slope, not far from the main house, where a narrow path wound toward a cluster of stone cottages, the growing weight of snow pressed silently against layers of ice and earth. Deep beneath the surface, a line of weakness began to shift, almost imperceptibly, as if the hillside was taking a slow, uncertain breath. The house introduced itself in fragments. The smell of wood smoke and polished oak, the soft scratch of logs settling in a hidden fireplace, the faint echo of laughter spilling from a door at the end of a corridor. Eleanor followed the Duke through the entrance hall, her boots silent on the thick rug that covered most of the stone floor. Daniel disappeared with her suitcase toward a side passage, leaving her feeling exposed in the wide, bright space. "Most of our guests have already arrived," the Duke said. "We keep the first evening informal. I find it helps people breathe before the program begins." "The program?" she repeated. He glanced at her, as if weighing how much to explain. "Conversations, mostly. Panels, if you like. Discussions by the fire. People who rarely find themselves in the same room. Invited to talk frankly about what they usually dress in careful language." "You make it sound almost dangerous," she said, unsure whether she meant it as a joke. "A storm outside and truths inside," he replied. "Everyone trapped long enough to listen. Some consider that dangerous." There was something in the way he said trapped that caught her attention, a flicker of something too sharp to be casual. Before she could ask more, he had stopped before a pair of tall doors and opened them onto a long drawing room where a dozen people stood or lounged in small clusters. Conversations faltered as they stepped in. Heads turned. Eleanor felt the familiar prickle of being assessed, measured against invisible criteria. Most of the guests looked older than her, dressed in expensive fabrics that fell in crisp lines. She recognized two faces from public life, a senior politician whose statements on energy policy she had once criticized in an op-ed, and a university vice-chancellor who frequently wrote about social mobility while presiding over rising tuition fees. "Everyone," the Duke said, his voice carrying easily, "this is Ms. Eleanor Ward. She writes about the realities people go through when policy turns into bills and notices on the kitchen table. Please be kind to her. She has agreed to observe us." There was a murmur of greetings, a polite ripple of interest. The politician offered a nod, the vice-chancellor a thin smile. Someone handed Eleanor a glass. She did not see who. The drink was warm, spiced and stronger than she expected. It settled her nerves enough for her to move further into the room. "Observe?" she asked quietly, turning to the Duke. "You're a journalist," he said. "You look at things. You notice what others gloss over. That is why you are here." "You want me to write about this weekend?" "In some form," he replied. "Nothing publishable without consent, but I find that people behave differently when they know someone is watching closely. Sometimes they try harder to be their best selves. Sometimes their masks fall off altogether." "And which do you prefer?" Eleanor asked. He studied her for a moment, then smiled without answering. "You will meet everyone in time. For tonight, you should eat something. There will be supper in half an hour. Mrs. Cartwright would never forgive me if any guest went hungry under this roof." He excused himself to greet a late arrival, leaving Eleanor standing near the fireplace. She took in details as she warmed her hands. The framed photographs on the mantelpiece, more candid than formal, the worn patch on the Persian rug near the piano, where someone's habitual pacing had left its mark, the crack in the window frame neatly filled with resin rather than replaced. This was not an untouched museum piece of a house. It was old, lived in, bearing the marks of choices made under pressure. "First time at Winter Haven?" a voice beside her asked. Eleanor turned to see a woman in her 40s, short dark hair tucked behind one ear, a glass of red wine dangling casually from her fingers. She wore a simple black dress and flat shoes, as if daring anyone to judge her for comfort over formality. "Yes," Eleanor said. "You?" "Third," the woman replied. "I'm Dr. Amrita Basu. I work with communities whose homes are slipping into the sea, while people in rooms like this debate the proper wording for acceptable loss." Eleanor almost laughed. "That sounds familiar." "Good," Amrita said. "Then you won't be easily impressed. Why did he bring you? You're younger, and you look like you still pay attention to bus timetables." "Maybe he wanted someone who remembers the price of bread," Eleanor said, then regretted her flippancy. Sorry, that sounded ungrateful. Don't apologize, Amrita replied. Whatever his reasons, he needs people here who are not dazzled by the chandeliers. He grew up in this house. He still thinks he can fix things from the inside. Fix what exactly? That, Amrita said, lifting her glass in a small, vague gesture that seemed to encompass the room, the estate, perhaps the country itself. Old agreements, old damage, old guilt, you'll see. These weekends weren't always like this. They used to be about hunting parties and charity balls. Then the accident happened, and suddenly the Duke wanted to talk about responsibility. Eleanor hesitated. What accident? Amrita's expression tightened. He didn't tell you? I only read rumors, Eleanor said carefully. A landslip on the estate. Someone injured. More than injured, Amrita replied softly. A hillside gave way after weeks of heavy rain. 2 workers from the village were buried. Only one was pulled out alive. The other left behind parents who had never set foot in this house, and a younger sister who still works double shifts at the care home. The official reports say it was an unfortunate natural event. Some of us think the truth is more complicated. Before Eleanor could respond, a sound rose above the murmur of the room. A distant rumble, low and sustained, like thunder heard from far below the ground rather than above it. Conversations paused. Glasses stilled midway to lips. For a heartbeat, everyone stood listening. Then the rumble faded, swallowed by the wind pressing against the windows. The room exhaled. Someone laughed too loudly. The piano picked up again, a few tentative notes turning into a melody. Old house, someone near the door said, always creaking in a storm. But Amrita's gaze had sharpened. That came from outside, she murmured. From the east slope, if I'm not mistaken. Eleanor glanced toward the tall windows. All she could see was her own reflection against the black glass, framed by drifting snowflakes. Beyond that, the night gave away nothing. Later, long after supper, after the polite conversations about policy and philanthropy had turned to quieter, more candid exchanges by the fire, the house began to settle. Staff moved through the corridors, closing curtains, banking fires, checking that windows were latched against the worsening storm. Guests retired to their rooms in 2s and 3s, voices muffled by thick carpets and the weight of the hour. The Duke stood alone on the east balcony, his coat collar turned up, watching the snow swallow the outlines of the hills. He knew every line of that landscape. He had ridden it as a boy, walked it as a teenager who wanted to escape the suffocating expectations of his title, mapped it again as a man who had inherited it sooner than expected. He knew where the ground held firm, where it shifted, where drains had been reinforced, and where budget cuts had delayed essential work. The memory of rain came back to him. The relentless weeks before the landslip years ago, the phone call in the middle of the night, the searchlights cutting through the darkness as local volunteers and estate workers clawed at the mud with frozen hands. The weight of a father's hand on his shoulder, the unspoken knowledge that the chain of decisions leading to that hill's weakness had not begun with either of them, but had passed through both their names. The sound that reached him now was faint, but unmistakable. A crack, like a giant bone breaking beneath the snow-blanketed earth. He froze, breath clouding the air in front of him. For a moment, nothing followed. Then a second sound came, deeper, a distant roar that grew in intensity, as if the hillside itself had finally decided it could no longer hold its shape. He moved before he realized he had decided to. The door to the balcony banged open behind him as he strode back into the corridor, calling for Daniel, for anyone still awake. The storm, which had seemed like mere weather an hour ago, now carried a new, more specific threat. Far from the house, On the east slope, where a narrow path wound between dry stone walls and an outbuilding once used as a shepherd's shelter, the snow gave way. A wide sheet of white tore free from the hillside and began to move, slow at first, then accelerating, gathering more snow, more ice, more broken branches. The avalanche did not roar like in films. It groaned and hissed and rumbled, a heavy, grinding sound as it slid over rock and earth, burying everything in its path. At the edge of its reach, two figures struggled through the storm, their outlines barely visible. One had come out from the house in defiance of the weather, craving air and silence. The other was returning from the staff cottages after checking on a sick relative. They had not expected to encounter each other on the path. They had not expected the ground to move beneath their feet. When the snow hit them, it was not a soft blanket, but a solid force, knocking them off their feet, flipping them as easily as if they were dolls. Cold-filled mouths and noses, the world turned white and weight and pressure. Then there was nothing but darkness, snow packed tight against skin, and the terrifying, crushing knowledge of being buried alive. When Eleanor regained consciousness, there was no sense of up or down, only pressure. Snow pressed against her ribs, her legs, the side of her face. Her left arm was pinned, her right hand trapped somewhere against her chest. Her first breath brought in nothing but icy granules. Panic flared, sharp and absolute. She forced herself to cough, to spit, to clear enough space near her mouth for a sliver of air. The darkness was complete. It was not the darkness of a room with the lights off, but the darkness of something solid, pressed inches from her eyes. The weight on her body was immense, but not yet crushing bone. She could not move much, but she could feel. Her fingers, toes, the tight hammering of her heart against her ribs. Think, she told herself. She had read once that people buried in avalanches survived longer if they stayed calm, conserved air, avoided shouting unless they heard rescuers nearby. Her instinct screamed at her to yell until her throat tore. But instinct was the same thing that had pushed her outside into the storm half an hour earlier, craving the quiet after too many intense conversations. She had paid for that impulse. Now she would have to rely on something else. She tested what little movement she had. Her right hand could wriggle enough to brush her scarf, her neck, the icy wall a few centimeters from her face. Her legs were more firmly trapped, one boot jammed at an awkward angle. She tried to bend her knees and felt only resistance. Somewhere close by, under the weight and silence, a muffled sound came, a low human groan. "Hello?" Her voice came out hoarse, the sound absorbed quickly by the snow. "Can you hear me?" The groan sharpened into a cough. Then a strained voice answered, male, with the same northern cadence she had heard in the drawing room. "Yes," he managed. "Yes. Where are you?" "Buried," she said, a hysterical bubble of laughter rising and dying in her throat. "I can't move. Can you?" "Not much." A pause. "You're Eleanor, aren't you?" She almost choked. "How do you know that?" There was a rustle, like someone trying to shift against heavy blankets. "I saw you go out. I was coming back from the cottages. I called your name, but the wind swallowed it. Then the hill moved." Another cough. "Daniel, I'm Daniel." The driver, the man who had met her at the station, who had guided the car along the snow-choked roads as if he had done it all his life. Now they were trapped together, somewhere under the slope between the house and the cottages. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "Nothing broken, I think," he said after a moment. "But I can't feel much below my waist. Might just be the cold, or not. Let's assume it's the cold." She tried to imagine their positions. Snow had swept them down. It might have thrown them close together or separated them by meters. The sound of his voice was muffled but not distant. That meant something. "People will notice we're missing," she said. "They'll come." "Yes," Daniel replied. He will come. You mean the Duke? There was something like a smile in Daniel's answer, even through the strain. He doesn't like losing people on his land. Eleanor's thoughts skittered to the story Amrita had told her about the landslip years ago, the workers buried, only one pulled out alive. She wondered if the Duke had been on the hillside that night, if he had dug with his own hands or watched others do it. She wondered what it did to a person to live with that history and still host elegant gatherings while the same ground loomed outside. Eleanor, Daniel said, his voice suddenly sharper, listen to me. You'll be colder soon. You might get sleepy. Don't go to sleep. Talk to me instead. Ask me anything. Shout at me. I don't care. Just stay awake. You sound like you've practiced this speech, she said. I have, he replied quietly. Once, in training, years ago, they showed us footage of rescues. They told us what to say to someone trapped in a car, in rubble, in snow. Keep them talking, keep them tethered to something. Who trained you? She asked, partly to follow his instruction, partly because curiosity was easier than fear. The army, he said, before I came here, before he found me. He hired you out of the army. Something like that. I knew how to drive in bad conditions. I knew how to keep quiet. Both skills proved useful in this job. The faintest hint of humor threaded through his words, and Eleanor clung to it. She asked about the estate, about the people who had worked there longest, about winters past. He answered in short bursts, slipping more often into silence as time stretched. She had no way of measuring minutes. The dark did not change. The weight did not shift. Once, she thought she heard a distant thud, then another, as if someone were striking the snow from above. She held her breath, listening. The sounds came again, more distinct this time, blows, then pauses, then muffled voices vibrating through the packed snow. "Daniel," she whispered, "do you hear that?" Yes. Relief and tension mingled in that single word. That will be them, or the storm playing a cruel trick. Let's assume it's them. The blows grew louder, more purposeful. Snow shifted near her shoulder, sending a trickle of chilling damp down her neck. A shaft of grey filtered through, not quite light, but less than full darkness. Someone shouted closer now, the words indistinct but urgent. The weight pressing on her chest eased by a fraction. For the first time since the avalanche hit, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that this might not be the end, that the story unfolding on this hillside was not destined to mirror the tragedy etched into the estate's history. "Hold on," a new voice called, clearer now, commanding and raw. "We're almost there. Just keep talking. Don't stop talking." She knew that voice. She had heard it greeting her at the doors of Winterhaven Hall, calm and controlled. Now it sounded different, frayed at the edges, breathless, as if the speaker had been digging with bare hands as well as tools. "Your Grace?" she called, her own voice cracking. A brief, stunned pause answered her, followed by a rush of renewed activity above. The blows came faster, more precise. Snow fell away from her face in clumps, and then suddenly cold air flooded in, sharp and glorious. A gloved hand reached through the opening, fingers searching. "Eleanor," the Duke said, his face appearing in the small window of grey sky. Snow clung to his hair. His cheeks were flushed with exertion, and his eyes, usually reserved, almost distant, burned with something fierce and unguarded. "I've got you,"